Hello, everybody, and welcome to Draft Questions Answered, the video series where I answer questions submitted by you, the viewer, to help you level up and improve at Limited. Today is a special Adventures in the Forgotten Realms themed edition, so I asked you for questions about Adventures of the Forgotten Realms on the Patreon, the Discord, and in the NicolaiBolas community tab, so thank you to everybody who submitted questions, and let's get to it. If you do enjoy this sort of video, remember to hit that like button. It really does let me know that you enjoy this sort of content, and also comment below with your questions about the questions that I answer and all of your other feedback as well, and you can subscribe for more content if that's something you're interested in. Getting to the first question from the Patreon, Unstable James asks, what do you think are the strongest color combinations in the set, and which mechanics/archetypes are best to draft for with those combinations? So, the de facto best deck in the format that everyone in the community has generally settled on is black-red. There are multiple different ways you can go about it. You can go aggressive, you can go steal your opponent's creatures and sacrifice them, you can go with a little bit of a more grindy, treasure-focused, splash some stuff deck, but overall black-red just has great tools, really good removal, really good aggressive threats, just strong on-rate cards, which is very powerful in this set. After that, red-white equipment is also a pretty good aggressive deck. Green-red can do some nice aggressive things. And then if you're going a little bit more mid-range, you get some higher rarity cards. White-black Venture is pretty good. Generally, the consensus is that blue is a little bit weaker than the other colors, and the non-blue color combinations can do some better stuff. Green-white life gain, another color combination, another deck that is pretty effective. But generally, if you're slanted towards aggression, you're going to be a little bit more supported in the format. Not that you can't do controlling stuff, but that's generally just some ideas on strongest color combinations, mechanics, archetypes, and things like that. Moving on to the next question, coming from the Discord, Brian O'Cheese asks, with the prevalence of Rakdos in this format, is there an archetype or certain cards to look for that will blindside all the Rakdos drafters? While I think that's an interesting question. It really does show a good awareness of how you can get an edge in Limited, because if everyone's drafting Rakdos and there's a card that's specially geared that's good against the Rakdos cards, then that can definitely give you an advantage. I will say, though, that in this set, there doesn't really seem to be a card that super punishes Rakdos, which is one of the reasons why Rakdos is so strong, is because it doesn't have any big weaknesses. I will say that if you can maybe go over the top of them sometimes once you stabilize, it's hard to do, but life gain can be helpful with that. Something like Hill Giant Herd Gorger at the top end can sometimes just be bigger than the Rakdos cards, so they can have removal. I would say that I think the best bet for beating Rakdos is that as more players catch on, which will probably happen over the course of the format, the cards will be contested, which means every Rakdos deck will get a little bit weaker and you'll be able to compete with them. So that's just one of the cool things about draft, is if it's self-correcting to a certain extent. So if Rakdos is the best deck, and it'll just turn out that 3 people in a draft pod or something like that, or 2.5 draft Rakdos, 2 people try, or 3 people try, 2 people succeed, that sort of thing. And then with lower, they'll just have to go deeper into the pool to get lower card quality, and then you can bounce back with some of the other decks, because there are a lot of sweet things to do in the format, even though Rakdos is quite good. Moving on to the next question. Venture feels fairly weak as a mechanic. Do you agree? And would you advise to largely ignore it and treat any Venture you do get as an occasional added bonus? That's a good question from Destroyer X2000. I would say that Venture has felt a little bit weak to me. What I've generally been doing is I haven't been taking the Venture cards super highly, though if you are in a Venture deck, then all of a sudden the Venture cards get quite powerful. So when you can get multiple Venture cards going, the bonuses are weighted towards the end of the dungeon, so if you have consistent Venture, then those cards can really carry you. I also like cards that are just strong on rate on their own, so something like UNT Fangblade, which is the 3-mana 2/2 Death Toucher that when it deals combat damage ventures, is a card that I just play in my decks because that 3-mana 2/2 Death Touch is just a good card, and then the Venture is an added bonus. Some cards just don't get there because Venture is not powerful enough, but then there are other cards where if you generally have a dividing line where you're either a Venture deck or you're not a Venture deck, and if you are a Venture deck, you'll play the Venture cards, and otherwise you won't play them, and you just treat it as that added bonus. And I do agree that it does feel a little bit weak, but I've had some fun doing Venture decks. I think that people go into the Tomb of Phandelver a lot. If you think you can actually finish it, I've found the Tomb of Annihilation to be pretty nice if you are attacking them a little bit. The pressure is nice, and the 4/4 Death Toucher is actually pretty nice, so I've kind of liked the Tomb of Annihilation in certain decks. But generally, you'll know whether you're a Venture deck or not, and if you have 4 or 5 Venture cards, you can actually do some cool stuff sometimes. Next question, are there any cards or synergies so broken that you would consider adjusting strategy or changing colors in Pack 3? So generally this question is going to come down to how deep you are in one color. Sometimes you'll be in a spot where you're like basically mono red, and then you have a couple of black cards, so you might play black red, and you have a couple white cards, so you might play red white, and then in pack 3 you open a great red white card and you kind of jump in from there. There are certainly strong cards in this format. There's quite a few rares that just feel like very, very difficult to beat. Just popping into my head, Westgate Regent, Ranger Class, Xanathar. A couple of the dragons are just like absurd. There's just quite a few cards that are really good, and that's one of the benefits of in draft staying flexible and making sure that your colors are more focused early on, because sometimes you can be in a spot where you have a choice between a card that's in your main color or a slightly more powerful card outside of your main color, and that's one of the potential rewards that it's good to be aware of. Is if you stick to one color, can you open something really good in pack 2 or even pack 3 that would incentivize you to switch? I wouldn't say adjusting strategy is a fair thing to do generally, because you want to make sure your deck is on theme, and if you are switching themes that late, it's really tough to do. But sometimes there will be situations where maybe you're playing a red-green deck and you open up a more controlling red-green card or something like that nature, and then you kind of hedge your deck towards the more defensive side. But generally you're going to be like aggressive going in, and then you'll open a card that maybe complements that strategy. Next question comes from YouTube. What is your opinion on Horde Robber? So for those who don't know, Horde Robber, I did plan things in advance. That's right. I pulled up the card image. Horde Robber was a card that I was not a huge fan of early on. Just like my first reading of it, a 2-mana 1/3 that needs to attack to do stuff just didn't seem good to me. But it's actually a pretty threatening 2-drop, because it has to be blocked a lot of the time, because otherwise you're just going to start generating an advantage. And that can be pretty powerful, because you can combine it with a combat trick or things like that, because you know they're going to block it. It's also nice because sometimes, even if they have a slightly better 2-drop than you, they won't attack you just because they're worried about you attacking them back and getting that treasure, ramping out a 4-drop, things of that nature. So Horde Robber can actually do some pretty good work, and I think it's a pretty solid playable 2-drop that you'll play in most of your black decks. So good question, and definitely good to reevaluate the cards as you go through the format. Next question from Andre. Do you like Delver's Torch? For reference, that is this equipment. And no, I'm not really a big fan of Delver's Torch. As I was saying, you generally want to be either an adventuring deck or a not adventuring deck. And I have found that if I am playing a venturing deck, I am not necessarily going to be an equipment deck. And just the overlap for decks that you'd want Delver's Torch is pretty slim. If I'm a beatdown deck that's using equipment, I'm generally not venturing. One of the problems that I've found with Venture is that because not every color combination ventures super hard, they all kind of dabble in it a little bit. I mean, a couple of the colors do it more than others. Like white-black, one of the reasons white-black is the best venture deck a lot of the time is because it has like the most venture cards in it. But if you're ending up in like a white-green deck and you have a couple cards with the word venture on them, adding a Delver's Torch doesn't necessarily like help you all that much, because you're only venturing a little bit every time, and getting only a couple stages through isn't going to be helpful. If you do have a deck where you're got a few venture cards, Delver's Torch can slot in, especially when combined with evasion, but +1/+1 is just not meaningful enough for 5 mana, and the venture is oftentimes like not super relevant. So I'm not a huge fan of the Delver's Torch. I haven't played it very often. Next question, what do you think about the 6-mana Beholder? And Saeed Duran is clearly trying to trip me up, because there are actually 2 6-mana Beholders. There's a common Baleful Beholder, which I assume they were talking about, because not everyone is as lucky as me in managing to open up Xanathar and get past it constantly. So I think Xanathar is an absolute bomb, definitely worth splashing and playing every time. Basically feels unbeatable when it's in play. So Xanathar is absolutely fantastic. And Baleful Beholder actually does work as well. It's rare that black gets such a massive like statted 6-drop. Like black isn't really generally known for like 6-mana 6/5. It does get it sometimes. There's a card called Bog Stomper for those who maybe played in one of the core sets a couple of them ago. That was actually pretty reasonable card considering all things considered. But Baleful Beholder, it just feels very good when you play it a lot of the time. You don't want to over prioritize 6-drops generally, because you can only afford to put so many in your deck, because if you draw like multiples in your opening hand, it's not good. But when you actually wipe out an enchantment with that, it feels like game winning a lot of the time, and Menace is also a nice upside. So I really actually am I'm pretty happy having a copy of Baleful Beholder in my deck, which isn't always the case with a random 6-drop. So it's a pretty solid card, I would say, and Xanathar is just a bomb. So you try to trip me up, but the only thing I'm stumbling over is my words, not the actual card. But yeah, getting there with those 6-mana Beholders. Moving on, how good does a card need to be to splash it? and should you ever splash a good 2 or even 1 drop? Dragon's Fire, Triumphant Adventurer. See, they really salvaged this. Good job, Jeff. I was definitely trying to focus on Adventures in the Forgotten Realms questions, and by adding those examples, you provided me with some good talking points about the set itself. So I almost would have skipped past this question because it wasn't on theme, but I really like answering this sort of question. So when it comes to splashing, the things you want to be thinking about are generally, is the card going to be good if I top deck it later, and is it worth the cost to my mana? So Dragon's Fire and Triumphant Adventurer are the cards mentioned, as Jeff was asking, is it worth it to splash a cheap card? And in this case, I would say that with Dragon's Fire, if you top deck it later in the game, 3 damage actually does kill a relevant number of creatures in the format, and I think that I actually have splashed Dragon's Fire, though I generally wouldn't gear my deck to splash just for Dragon's Fire. So if I think if you're already planning on splashing red, sometimes you can then get a little bit more ambitious and just splash the extra card, but just singleton splashing a Dragon's Fire is often not going to be worth it because a 2-mana deal 3 isn't necessarily what you want. But if you're a little bit light on removal and you have some tools for fixing, like if you have some treasures lying around, if you have an Evolving Wilds, those are the sorts of cards that can let you splash a Dragon's Fire if your deck really needs some interaction. I will say though, with Triumphant Adventure, this is the type of card where you don't want to splash it generally because it's best on turn 2, and when a card thrives in the early turns, even if it's very powerful like Triumphant Adventure, which can really snowball a game, the fact that if you top deck it on turn 6 or 7, they're just going to have a board state that's big enough to like put 2 1/1s to block it, or a 2/2 and a 1/1 or something like that, and it's not going to be able to get through. And you have to imagine like, oh, if I'm sitting with this card in my hand for an extended amount of time and I can only play it in the late game, is the card going to have a relevant impact? And because Triumphant Adventure is so staggered towards the played on turn 2 and snowball aspect, it's generally not powerful enough in the late game to want to splash it. Whereas Dragon's Fire, if your deck really needs removal and you already have some tools for splashing, I can definitely see splashing it. I've done it myself, where you're like, well, I need some extra interaction. I'm already splashing red. I think I was splashing red for Orcus in that case or something like that. But who's keeping track of those sorts of things? But Dragon's Fire can definitely be splashable. When you are splashing, keep in mind that worsening your mana is a major cost, and also the card isn't always going to be castable, so you need to make sure it's high impact when you do get to cast it, or it fills a role in your deck that you really need filled at an efficient rate. Next up, when should you play around possible combat tricks or counterspells in AFR? Do you ever play around Price of Loyalty in this format? Cheers from Joe. Well, thank you, Joe, for the question. I will say, these are the counterspells and the aforementioned Price of Loyalty. I don't play around the counterspells as much in this format unless it's very obvious. So sometimes your opponent keeps a 7-card hand, doesn't do anything on turn 2, doesn't do anything on turn 3, and they just hold up their 3 blue mana, and they're like, well, I'm going to get you, and then you can just avoid it. Sometimes to play around Bar the Gate, I'll just play like a non-creature spell in some situations where they just waste the mana from Bar the Gate, and it's essentially game losing. But generally, when the counterspells are bad, playing around them is worse than just running into it and having your opponent have it sometimes. So Bar the Gate and You Find the Villain's Lair are not particularly good in the format. They're actually kind of bad. I don't think they're worth playing in most cases. And for that reason, you generally don't want to play around them because you're giving your opponent more equity, as if they, like, you're acting as if your opponent has them, even though they're generally not going to have them. And so by doing so, you're not actually gaining a lot, because in the situations where you're not going to be playing around it very often because they're not going to have it very much. If you Bar the Gate cost like 2 mana and the card was like really pushed and very good, which, if I'm being honest, if Bar the Gate cost 2 mana, blue actually might just be a solid color in this format, because that would just be a very, very good card. 2 mana, like Essence Scatter that can venture, is just a nice card. So maybe that's all that needed to change to make blue good, though. I think blue's okay. I mean, I'm fine playing blue decks because I like variety as well. So, and I also haven't played like 50 drafts like some people have, but that's a little bit off topic. But I think because Bar the Gate and You Find the Villain's Lair aren't very good, it means you shouldn't play around them very often, unless it's very obvious that they have something, or you're playing best of 3 and you've already seen those cards. Price of Loyalty is a little bit more interesting when it comes to playing around it, because it is kind of hard to play around, in that you have to oftentimes leave back 2 blockers or something like that. But I will say that if you're in a situation where you can afford to play around it, you might as well. So for example, one spot where you might play around it is if your opponent is at, say, 10 life, and you have a Hill Giant, Herd Gorger, and a 1/1 lying around, and you're at like 5. You don't have to attack with the extra 1/1, because if your opponent top deck Price of Loyalty, they would kill you then because you don't have any blockers. And so you can just insulate yourself against Price of Loyalty for very little cost, because we're just, in this case, I'm just assuming everyone is like empty-handed and it's just like pretty clear board. So in those sorts of spots, you can play around Price of Loyalty with no extra cost to yourself. And those are just the extra edges where you're opponent might not even have Price of Loyalty, but in those games where they top deck it, all of a sudden you're no longer losing, which is a really big edge to gain for very little cost. In a lot of close games, if your opponent hasn't indicated that they've had it, I am not sure I would play around it. Like if you really need that extra point of damage, it's often not worth it to play around cards you haven't seen. But then again, in best of 3, if you have seen Price of Loyalty, that's one of those things where in best of 1, playing around cards is oftentimes weaker because you're not sure they have it, and so you giving your opponent credit for cards, missing out on points of damage, missing out on attacks is a high cost that is known, whereas the unknown cost is based on them having the card in their deck, which is not a guarantee by any means, them drawing the card, and then having that play around be worth more than the extra point of damage that you're guaranteed to get, or whatever that situation is. But in some situations, it's definitely worth playing around Price of Loyalty. So pretty long-winded answer there for that one, but I like the question. It's a very interesting thought process. If Bar the Gate and you find the Villain's Lair were better, you'd play around them more often, and Price of Loyalty is oftentimes kind of a card that you can play around in free roll situations, but oftentimes the cost of playing around it is not something you should be willing to pay. That is going to do it for this episode of Draft Questions Answered. I really do hope you enjoyed it. I enjoy answering your questions, and so I enjoy getting feedback on whether you like it. Remember to hit that like button to help the video succeed and to let me know that you enjoy this sort of video. It's a little bit off the beaten path from what I normally make, and so your feedback on whether you enjoyed it is really helpful to me. As I said at the beginning, comment with your questions, thoughts, feedback. Leave hashtag found realms, because they're no longer the forgotten realms. They are the found realms. I guess it should be the remembered realms. So if you're a super pro, you can say hashtag remembered realms, because I messed that up. Also, if you recognize the card that I used as the background for this presentation, this video, if you will, be sure to leave that in the comments below, because I'm interested to know who recognizes this quality piece of art that I actually have played quite a few times in my day. It's one of my most played cards in Magic, probably. So fun little art challenge for you there. And hashtag remembered realms, because the opposite of forgotten is not found. So yeah, not the greatest grammar there in past Nicolai, but luckily current Nicolai is able to redeem the errors of the past. And also subscribe for more content if you do want to find that. And you can find a host of other things, like if you want to be able to ask questions on the Discord server or talk to folks in the community in the Discord, it's free to join. It's linked in the description down below. And things like the Patreon to support my work are as well. All sorts of good stuff. That is going to do it for this video, though. I hope you enjoyed watching it. And thank you so much to everybody who submitted questions. I couldn't get to all the questions that were submitted, but there were a ton of good ones. And I tried to pick the ones that were most relevant. But there were a lot of questions that were good that I still didn't get to. So I really do appreciate everyone who submitted questions, and I hope you submit questions for the next time I do something like this. That's going to do it, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.